All right. Hello, this is Emacs 24, I think. And today I'm going to be talking to Prot, who is going to join eventually. In about 5 minutes is our scheduled time. And I want to pick his brain about newcomers, the newcomer experience for Emacs, the starter kits, what we can do to make it easier for people to get into Emacs, and how we can support lifelong learning. So let me spend a few minutes here getting all set up so that if you have any questions, you can use the YouTube chat during the live stream so that I can read your questions out loud to Prot, and also so that I can share everything. I think my audio is working. And also, in the meantime, I can tell you what I've been doing lately. I have just posted a guide to newcomers-presets, which is a new feature in Emacs 31. It's a theme that enables a bunch of defaults, that changes a bunch of defaults to make it a little bit nicer for people. And let's see, what was that? Ding ding. I don't know what that sound just meant. We're going to find. Oh, okay. Prot. It says he's in the Google Meet room, so I will now admit him. And I think we should be live. Fantastic.
Hello.
Hello. All right.
Hello, Sacha. Good day.
Hello, Prot. Good day. Thank you for joining early. I was just doing my pre-session panicking
Good.
and warming up. But since we're here, and since I have a hard stop in about 1 hour, a little over 1 hour, since I have to make the kiddo a grilled cheese sandwich, let's dive right into it. So,
Yes. The grilled sandwich cannot wait.
no, she'll be hungry. So, the theme for the Emacs Carnival this month was newbies and starter kits. And it
hmm
gives us a good excuse to start thinking about how do we make the Emacs experience better for new users. Now, I know you
hmm
probably have run into a lot of new users from
Yeah.
the talks that you've been giving, the packages you make, the everything, the coaching. So
hmm
here, tell me about what you've been thinking about this so far.
Yeah. So, broadly speaking, there are a few pain points that I think every new user experiences. One is the behavior of Control G. The fact that you have the minibuffer open and you do Control G, because Control G is supposed to get you out of where you are. And the minibuffer will stay open by default. And I have seen people struggle live. It's like, oh, they have the minibuffer open, they click somewhere else, then they type Control G, the minibuffer stays there, and they're like, what is happening? Why is this not working? It stopped working. That's the one thing. The other big area where a lot of people, not just beginners, struggle with is anything related to display buffer, which can be configured, of course, via the display buffer A-list. And some of the common pain points with that are the fact that many windows do not focus by default. For example, you open a help buffer, it doesn't focus the window by default. So if you want to type Q to dismiss it, you have to switch to it, then type Q. You do occur, it doesn't focus occur by default. You have to go there and then interact with it, these sorts of things. And then there are a few other things. I have written some settings that I can share with you as well. Maybe I can, I don't know, email them to you and then you can. So, I don't hear you now. 1 second.
Sorry, I turned on mute. Do you want to share your screen? Because that's another thing
Yes,
you can do.
of course. But I meant to say that, so I have this here, and I was, of course, about to write a blog post and all that. Let me increase the font size. Is this font size okay, or is it too
Oh, this
small?
is good. Yeah.
Okay. So I have written a few things, so I don't have to go through all of them. But these are basically good defaults based on what I have noticed. Another thing that is really common is, how do I actually set my fonts, right? Because there are like a million ways to do this as well. And the people are like, okay, but which is the one that I should be using? And of course, when I pick one option, I don't mean to say that this is the right option, but it's just to not be technical about it. Like, okay, just use this and forget about it.
All
A
right. So
few
it's
other
go ahead.
settings
Yeah.
and a few common packages And at the end of this, oh, sorry, I have to really make this point. Ediff by default is unusable. Out of the box, ediff is literally unusable. Like, I cannot excuse that. Everything else I can excuse. This is not excusable. Sorry.
All right.
This is the minimum viable setup for it.
So maybe that's something to suggest for newcomer presets, or maybe even the defaults.
Yes,
That could just be changed.
I would say the
everyone.
defaults. This is not a newcomer thing. Like, basically, if you want to have that default layout, you just have to opt into it. Yes. And yeah, sorry if I am offending anyone, but I don't mean to say that. You have to consider the ergonomics of it. And then towards the bottom of this list, some packages, third-party packages, that I recommend for installation. This is not exhaustive. I try to be minimalist here. So, of course, there are many, many good, excellent, top-notch packages that I don't recommend here. And for example, I don't recommend any of my packages here. But I just included some for people to get started.
So it sounds like we should have a Prot starter kit.
No, I already have too many packages that I maintain.
Okay. Anyway, so it also sounds like you are talking to a lot of newbies, and you are hearing a lot about a lot of pain points and frustrations. How are people finding information in the first place? Hang on a second.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. How are people finding this information? Like, how are people? Do people tell you about their experience of getting into Emacs? How to, where they're finding the stuff? How do they find their way to you?
Generally, they muddle through. So they will find a blog post, they will find a video, they will just do some search. Now, of course, there is also LLMs providing feedback. So it's a combination of all those, and they try to piece together whatever kind of knowledge those sources provide. The thing with the newcomer experience is that there isn't a curation of content. Like, of course, you were doing that thing with the wiki, right? So, of course, you are working towards that. But what I mean is there are like options, like, oh, you can do it in these 10 different ways. But for a newcomer, this is just details that don't make sense, because the newcomer cannot weigh the pros and cons of each option, or even if they have pros and cons, or they are just different ways of expressing the same intent, such as with the fonts, for example. You can do the frame fonts or the faces or whatever.
Okay, so if there was something more curated, what would that look like? I know you spend a lot of time thinking about the information architecture of your documentation, which is the lovely thing about your one of the many lovely things about your packages. But what could that kind of newcomer experience look like for documentation?
What you were doing with the wiki, I think, is the right approach from a community perspective, meaning like, yeah, here is the single point of entry, and take it from there. Basically, don't look elsewhere. Like, start with this. No matter what you do, start with this. I think that's a good approach, and basically, in the community, we should be agreeing on that. Like, I didn't see all of your video yesterday. I didn't have the time to watch all of it. But basically, on the Emacs subreddit, which is basically where a lot of people find information, that's the first thing that should be on the sidebar. Or basically, it could even be pinned on the top of the tips and tricks section, the thread there. So that's the one thing. Yeah, sorry, please.
Yes, so the Emacs subreddit does have in its sidebar a link to the Emacs wiki, not calling out the Emacs newbie page specifically, but there's a link to the Emacs newbie page from the Emacs wiki homepage, I think.
Okay.
But yeah, so, as long as we can come up with a reasonably coherent starting point for people, then that will inevitably show up in people's recommendations as they respond to all these threads.
Yes, very well. Other than that, I really like the direction of the newcomers theme. I don't know exactly now if newcomers theme works in practice. Like, I don't know what happens if you do Emacs disable theme, or specifically what I mean. I haven't tried this, but what I mean, if you do this, map C, disable theme, right? The custom enabled theme. Maybe you have seen this, right? So you want to disable all the other themes before loading your theme, right? I'm sure somebody has written something like this. Maybe I have done it. And then it's like, load your favorite theme now, right? And then you do your favorite theme or whatever. For example, here. So in this case, I don't know what happens to the newcomers theme. I will assume that it will disable it. In which case, I think that has to be prevented.
Oh, but then it wouldn't be treated the same as other things. And that
Which
would be,
you can do, for example, if I go to Fontaine, and of course I got this from use package, but you can do it with a synthetic theme. So
Well-
there is a little trick you can do.
So I was looking at newcomers theme recently, newcomers presets recently, and when I was trying to make instructions for people to actually use this stuff, I ended up leaning towards just telling them to use like either the splash screen, of course, or MetaX customized themes, from where they can check and uncheck things if they wanted additional themes layered on top of that. It is it's not like you can't like uncheck it and then all of your settings go back to what they were before. Some of the things are still left over, but
Yes.
yeah, that might be their.
And so that's why I like the direction. I'm not sure if it should be a theme though. I think it should be a minor mode. And the minor mode should be like, here is the opinionated settings and here are the default settings.
Do we already have like a mechanism for letting minor modes override the variables in a nice way, but let you go back to the previous version? Because it's not just restoring the default customized ones either.
I do something like that in Logos, but I'm not sure, to be honest, right now, how I even do it. Set arg. And maybe, this was a long time ago, so I cannot even recall what exactly I was doing. But actually, this was contributed by Daniel Mendler. So, of course, something like this could be added to core Emacs as part of the newcomers theme eventually. If not, somewhere in core anyway. But I think it shouldn't be a theme. Basically, I like the idea. I don't think that it's the right tool. Because themes are...
Okay.
It's also confusing language,
Yeah.
Because theme, when you talk to the average person, they will think of like the style and they won't think about arbitrary customizations. Whereas in Emacs, we have this idiosyncratic conception of theme where it's like any kind of user option as well as faces.
So it sounds like if it were a package that defined a minor mode that people could turn on and off, that might be a little easier for people to try, and it doesn't necessarily, people then don't have to wait for Emacs 31. They can just, use package. If they trust copying and pasting this use package git thingy into it, like VC, then they can try it out right away.
Even better, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And there is this user option. I forget, do I even have it here for the built-in packages? I don't remember if I added it here. No, there is something like update the built-in packages. So there is an option like that. So of course, it could be like built into Emacs 31 as well as LPA, kind of like eglot. And then users could be like, okay, update this. So going forward, they can also benefit from whatever comes from Emacs 31. Or, the development target of Emacs going forward.
One of the challenges that I encountered when I was starting to play around with newcomers presets or other things like that is like it turns on all these options, but there's no easy way for people to say, okay, this is what has changed. This is how to use it. So I've started documenting that. And I think this is a challenge generally for many of the starter kits. It takes already a lot of work to make the configuration and make and maybe answer people's questions or deal with people's, like it doesn't work or how do I do this and so on and so forth. That there isn't as much documentation like, okay, here's the starting point, here's how to actually do stuff with it. How do we address that problem?
It's a tricky situation, like how best to do it. Well, I guess the natural place for that is the manual. And the manual, I believe right now the manual mentions something along the lines of, well, newcomers can just toggle this on kind of thing. But it doesn't really tell them what that will entail. So I think it's worth actually keeping track of all the changes and be like, well, the newcomers theme will change this and that and the other, and it could just be a bullet point of items. Maybe it doesn't have to go into all the technicalities. Like, hey, we are changing, I don't know, the I search so that it shows the counter. By default, it doesn't show the counter, right? Like, it doesn't need to be as detailed. It can just say, okay, these are the user options that are affected, or the minor modes that are enabled, and so on.
And I think it kind of, if we zoom out a little bit, it's one of the bigger challenges if you're new to Emacs or even a more experienced user. It's the workflows, not so much the the specific commands or variable settings or whatever.
Yes.
It's like how do I combine these different concepts to do something, or taking a step back further, something we've talked about in previous conversations. How do I even begin to learn this overwhelming number of concepts? How do I start to memorize all these keyboard shortcuts? And I'm not sure we have a lot of support for that yet.
No, because I think part of the challenge here is the terminology. For example, if we say completion, like me and you and other users, we kind of know what we are talking about, right? So minibuffer and orderless and all that, right? But if the user wants to express something along the lines, they may say, oh, the search box, or like the interaction panel or whatever. So they don't have a language of the completion framework or the mini buffer or whatever. So even then it can be tricky for them to kind of narrow down what they are searching for. And maybe then it makes sense to also think in terms of clusters of configuration, kind of what starter kits do with the various modules they define. And you can have aliases for them. Aliases in the manual, I mean, like in the manual, if you type I, it goes to the index, right? And you can have a concept index. So you can have a concept index for the search panel or whatever. And that means the mini buffer and friends.
So it's like we're doing search engine optimization so that people can find things with the words that they use. I'm not sure that will be in the Emacs manual itself, but one of the things I've appreciated about people sharing, their notes through blog posts and things like that is because they're using their words to describe a concept and they're linking it to the code that uses the words that Emacs does. So then people can then say, oh, I'm looking for this. It's actually called this in the Emacs world. But this takes time for people to kind of make those connections. What was it like, if you can look back to like 2019 when you were learning all of this stuff for the first time? What was it like for you as a non-programmer to come into this world where people are using all these strange terms?
Yeah, it was a challenge for sure. But I think actually the fact that I started out as a beginner into programming, I mean, benefited me in the sense that I was a blank slate. I didn't have to unlearn terms. So I didn't have a concept of, okay, in other I don't know, programming IDEs, for example, they call this the narrowing framework or whatever. I was like, that completion. Okay, let's move on. Like it was the first time I was introduced to such concepts. So I think in that sense I was lucky. That granted, there is a lot of reading involved. Like I was reading the manual and learning from it.
And that's something I do too. I mean, I'll still casually flip through the Emacs manual or the org manual because every time you read it, there's something else that catches your eye and makes you think, oh, how do I use that? How do I do that? And I like that, you and Mickey Peterson and other people have also been organizing these thoughts into like a linear arrangement of logical progression. So that's the books that there aren't a lot of books about Emacs that people can
Mm-hmm.
read. But how do
Mm-hmm.
people get to something like your Emacs Lisp elements? How do we support their learning journey from I have absolutely no idea how to do anything in Emacs to okay, I'm ready to read this book and get stuff out of it?
Yeah, yeah. When I recommend that book, I recommend it to people who have already decided that Emacs is the right tool for them. So I would basically say, look, eLisp is for you if you are already sold on Emacs, because what eLisp gives you is that extra you need to make Emacs do what you want, basically to tap into the potential programmability of Emacs. But to get to that point, you have already been convinced that, well, you already like Emacs. Like if you don't vibe with it, like from the outset, you won't learn eLisp, not least because it's a niche language.
Okay, so how do we get people to the point where they can vibe with Emacs? Like
Yeah,
where
which
they
is
can appreciate it, because when they start off, it's this like clunky text editor that has these weird keyboard shortcuts and strange terms, and all we can do is offer them videos and blog posts from people who say this is totally awesome. I've been using it for like 3 years or 20 years or whatever, and I love it. That's the light at the end of the tunnel, but there's a lot of tunnel to get through.
correct. It's difficult, and I think that's why something like the newcomers theme ultimately is the way forward, where it's like, yeah, opt into this, and that's already a good set of defaults. And I think what really matters is to reach a point where you can actually open your files, actually move around, and that happens with the very basics. Like that happens with the tutorial already. What the tutorial doesn't give you is the basic interface, such as the minibuffer. Like the default minibuffer, I don't think it's good for beginners. Actually, maybe it's not even good for advanced users, but that's another. Like you have to have a few of the basic packages enabled, and then the tutorial, I think, is enough for that initial push. Then, of course, it's also up to the user to do some reading based on what you will provide them with.
Yeah, I know. When I was trying this, I started a fresh Emacs so that I could see what it's like when people don't have the accumulated craft of 20 years of configuration. And I was like, I need some kind of completion that I don't have to keep pressing tab for. So maybe Fido vertical mode can be part of that, standard, like at least the newcomers presets or whatever. That would be nice. But yeah, there are a lot of these niceties that reduce the friction enough that people can then start enjoying things more and more. But of course, so newcomers presets are some kind of starter kit. They're great at getting people over that initial hump, but the challenge with starter kits and probably things like the newcomers presets has also been that when people ask for help, it's hard because they don't know the things that have changed under the hood. So they're asking for help, and the people who are helping them are like, I don't know what's going on there.
Mm-hmm. More so if the starter kit has its own macros and way of doing things, such as Doom Emacs. On the one hand, Doom Emacs does an excellent job at integrating everything, providing a polished experience, comprehensive configuration, and so on. On the other hand, they have their own way of doing things. Like they have their own macros. You have to use Doom sync or whatever to do things from the command line. So somebody who is not using Doom basically has no means of knowing what is happening in that world. So that is definitely a challenge. So for me, a good starter kit is one that at the very least uses what a generic configuration would use, meaning no macros, no weird shell scripts, and that sort of thing.
And I did spend some time going over the starter kit list in the Emacs wiki to try to sort it by kind of minimalist, stays close to vanilla, all the way to the changes a lot of things about Emacs, and you probably should ask the community of that starter kit first if you need help. So that's kind of like Doom Emacs and Spacemacs at that end of the spectrum, and things like better defaults would be like at the just a little bit of smoothing over of things. But then also it was interesting to see some of the starter kits focus on saying, okay, you don't have to write any code to extend this further. A lot of the things are available through Customize. Now, Customize is pretty overwhelming also for a newcomer. So how do we get people to the point where they might feel comfortable going through this Customize interface and saying, oh, I can find what I want to change and I can change it and I'm not worried about breaking everything?
Yeah, I actually, when I was trying to use Customize with people, I gave it an honest try. Like, for example, we tried to do Emacs Customize, the org capture templates. And I was seeing it live, impossible for people to understand what is happening. Like, customize has this concept of the insert button, right? So if you have a list of things, you can do insert to add the next element to the list. If you have an eLisp understanding of what you are actually interacting with, you kind of know what to do, right? But otherwise, I was seeing it live. It's like, I have no idea what is happening. Like, what is this? So for me, my approach is basically skip customize altogether. Like for me, it's a lost cause. Unless it's completely rewritten, I mean in its current form, it's not good for beginners unless it's for toggles, like, true or false kind of thing. If it's for anything more involved, it's not that good. And what it is good for is for discovery of user options, but it presents the user options in what's it called, human readable format, which you cannot just copy paste into your configuration. So, for example, it doesn't have the dashes for the names.
Yeah, and getting it out of the customized variables, if you wanted to keep a nice clean Emacs, is hard. Although I guess I would say that's more of an intermediate level concern. So
Yeah,
when they start caring about having a beautiful Emacs that other people can learn from.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So a couple of comments in from people who are watching the stream. Hello, folks. Yeah. So
Hello.
Hajavanta says hi, legends. Jackson and Peter say, Jackson says hi. Peter says I am not worthy. Stack Overflow says Sacha and Prot. Thank you for these streams. Shay says I love Emacs but haven't really learned eLisp. And I know Shay has been using Emacs for a long time, so that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
You have people who enjoy using Emacs. I don't know whether something is getting in their way when it comes to learning Emacs Lisp, or whether it's just totally fine already the way it is. So that's different things. Jackson says, Hajaswanta says, you are worthy if you are willing to learn. And maybe maybe the resources are there for people as people start digging into Emacs Lisp. Maybe the combination of it's looking at other people's source code and trying to ask on Reddit or whatever is enough. Jackson says, I vibe with Emacs after using other text editors that were not minimalist enough for my preferences, plus having experience with other open source software like Linux. Peter says, well, Emacs and minimalist in the same sentence. Same concept, but I know what you mean. And, all this whole spectrum of things you can do with Emacs, right? So people can just use basic Emacs. And then Peter says, I guess learn starters quickly to use Emacs, debug-init. Maybe not in the first hour, but close to it, close to tweaking.
Yeah.
So
Which of course doesn't help. It's very useful, of course, but it doesn't help beginners because they cannot read the backtrace.
It is hard to navigate, even for people who are experienced. Like, there's a whole bunch of things, and what you need to change is like a small thing, and they don't know about edebug and all that other stuff.
But of course, debugging it many times, of course, it is a lifesaver for sure.
Yeah, and I think a lot of these things can be stepped around if you have, like someone more experienced with Emacs to watch over your shoulder either in person or virtually and say, do it this way instead, or have you heard about this package? But this is an experience that I think not a lot of people have, because many times they're isolated, right? They're the only Emacs person they know around them, and maybe they'll go to a meetup, but maybe they're intimidated by the idea of asking about their beginner problem with all these other people talking about arcane Emacs Lisp things. So how do we get people to the point where they can get help?
Yeah, I think this is partially bridged, this gap is partially bridged by LLMs. Like a lot of people will just check with a bot and get something useful out of it and basically continue from there. And that's why I said earlier they muddle through, because LLMs, of course, will give you what you ask. So if you kind of don't know what to ask, you will get something that may be useful, maybe needs a further tweak to it. That's why sometimes it's hit or miss.
And I am seeing that in a lot of the discussion threads now, people are of course, people are concerned about the environmental impacts and the ethical, considerations around large language models. But there are also people who are saying, this is what helped me write my first bit of Emacs Lisp, or this is what helped me figure out how to configure Emacs to do the thing that I wanted to do. So for that, I'm like, okay, then maybe there's something there. Challenge, of course, if it's hallucinating something, you're like, no, that function does not actually exist. You got to do it this other way. But if you can get them over some of the humps, maybe that's useful for them.
Yes. I think, of course, it's not 100% good, but I think it is on the balance. I think it is good.
So when people are too embarrassed or too intimidated to ask people in person, and when I go to these meetups, everyone's always super friendly. Sometimes we're live debugging someone's configuration or someone's function in real time. But sometimes that is a little difficult for people to get to for schedule or other reasons. There are other ways to understand something and ask questions about it and figure it out.
Yeah.
But sometimes you don't even know what to ask questions about.
Exactly.
How do we help people in that situation where, like, okay, they want to, they don't even know that they're doing something inefficiently and that the solution for their problems is like just one package away? How do we help?
That's difficult because it's on a case-by-case basis. Like, I think you cannot optimize for that because each person will have different intuitions or different pain points, let's say. And maybe you can do it by having the most exhaustive kind of documentation with the equivalent of search engine optimization, as you were saying earlier. But I think eventually people will still have questions, and even the formulation of the question may be idiosyncratic. So even if the concept is there, the way it is presented, you might not have a perfect match.
And the idiosyncrasy of things is something that it's definitely a challenge for us when we're working with Emacs, because everyone has their own way of doing things, and therefore has their own like thing that how they set it up, or the keyboard shortcuts that they use, or the ways that they want the functions to work. So just like even trying to write documentation to say, when if you're learning this, you might want to check out this stuff next, is
Yes.
I have a hard time figuring out how to make that make sense to as many people as possible without overwhelming them with like 20 different questions.
That's the difficult part. I think that's the part where you have to assume that people will fill in the blanks. For example, I think yesterday you were doing this thing where, somebody needs to use Git, but what is even Git? So you have to even know about Git, right? And that's recursive because, how do you install Git? Well, you need a terminal. What is a terminal, right? You need to have this thing called Linux. What is a Linux? So basically, at some point, you have to just say, like, I will give you as much as I can, but I will limit it to the scope of this, like Emacs, basically.
Yeah,
Because otherwise, it has infinite scope.
and I find that hyperlinks help a lot with that then, because you can say, if you need a more detailed description, you can go over there. So now I'm trying to make it easier for myself. Whenever I say, oh yeah, put this in your .emacs, I'm just like, I'm just going to link to the Emacs wiki page on init files, because there's this whole discussion that you have to have about what is your .emacs, and sometimes it's actually your .emacs.d/init.el, but sometimes it's actually your .config/emacs/init.el, and just pass that off to a page to explain all of that stuff.
Yeah. Actually, I want to say something about this because now it reminded me. So many people nowadays will use .emacs.d/init.el or .config emacs.init.el, but Emacs defaults to reading the .emacs file from your home directory.
Yes.
And I had this case where a user was writing their init file in one of those specified locations, but they did something with Emacs Customize beforehand, and Emacs Customize wrote to the .emacs file. So they were loading Emacs and nothing was showing up. And they were like, what is wrong? My init file is there. Why is it not working? I'm loading, this dark thing. Why is it white or whatever? And eventually it was because of the .emacs file. I'm not sure how best to resolve that, given that you want to also be backward compatible.
No. Okay, so when I tell people just here's a link to the init file page in the Emacs wiki, it also includes a describe variable user init file, which
Yes.
will tell you which one is actually loading. And I have a to-do to suggest an Emacs devel, if they haven't already discussed it endlessly, that maybe there should be kind of like a metax find user init file that just
Yes.
opens that specific file. Would be nice.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah. Okay, so a couple of going back to the chat because people have been sharing great comments as well. So Shay says, I learned about new Emacs packages by pairing with other users and asking, how did you do that thing? Which I think is a great great thing for screencasts. So people sharing videos as well, because when people share a video, sometimes they see things that they wouldn't have mentioned because they totally take advantage of. It's just something they take for granted. But like for example, in your live stream package maintenance sessions, I'm sure you've had this a couple of times. People are asking, "What is that? That you just did?"
Yeah,
so
yeah.
videos are great for this. Okay.
One second. Let me open the door for my puppy. One second.
Oh, yes,
I'll be
puppies.
back, and I'm checking.
Yeah.
One second.
Yes. In the meantime, yes. Let's see if there's anything here I can address by myself. Some people.
The puppies cannot wait.
No, the puppies cannot wait. Just small mammals in general are like they need us. Okay. Hajavanta says. I used Emacs since 2010 and had become a power user, but in the last year, I feel LLMs took over most of the tasks I usually solved with Emacs. I mean, actually, it's a bit of a tangent here, but we're seeing that also with some of the long-term users of Emacs moving on to other editors because whatever they had customized on top of Emacs could be replicated by a custom application written like by an LLM. So it's the kind of the movement is going both ways. People leaving Emacs for other things, people coming into Emacs because LLMs can help them with stuff. So I just wanted to mention that because things are happening.
Yeah, good.
Peter says, Emacs documentation is very extensive, but I feel discovery of the docs is a problem for new users. And I want to dig into that a bit more. How do we help with this discovery thing?
Yeah, there are, like in the info manuals, if you know two key bindings, it really helps a lot. One is G, the other is I. But you have to have completion already set up, like vertical mode, for example.
I also like using S for search.
Or S for search.
Yeah.
Like those help a lot because then you can jump to a node or an index. Without those, navigating the manuals can feel cumbersome. That granted, we are back to the point where the user also has to do some research on their own. Like, you cannot compensate for drive motivation. Like, no matter how much we write, no matter how many themes or minor modes we define, the user also has to be searching.
Yeah, and it's going back to the challenge of being overwhelmed. Sometimes it's difficult for new users to say, okay, there's so much to learn. How do I scope this so that I don't go crazy? What is the most important thing that I need to learn about first? And then what is the tiniest step after that I can take? And so forth. Otherwise, it's just like, I want to learn about everything.
Based on the discussions I have had, I think the consensus is address your immediate needs. For example, you want to write a to-do list. All you need to know at this early stage is org mode. And not all of org, because org has like approximately 1 zillion commands. Just to do and done, right? And maybe schedule a date. And just learn that. And by learning that, do that for a week, do it for a month, however long it takes for you to embed it as part of your knowledge. And then once you have done that, move on to the next thing. Like, okay, now that I am solid on my to-dos, how do I do the agenda, for example? And incrementally add to that. And the idea is, by piecing together your system this way, you achieve two things. First, you build on a solid foundation of knowledge where you know what you are doing. And two, you understand how your system is pieced together. So if something breaks, you already have an intuition of what it could be, even if you don't know Emacs Lisp. You can guess like, oh, I added this thing the other day and now my Emacs is broken. So probably the breakage is there.
And this decomposing it into those tiny steps so that you can piece them together and build slowly, understanding each step along the way, is something that new people struggle with because they don't have the experience to know what the small step is. And I think that's where coaching and mentoring and sometimes if you're lucky enough to be able to sit with somebody who says, okay, your next step is just to do this, that would be super lucky. But most people will just have to content themselves with sometimes there's a playlist of videos that they can follow in sequence. Or maybe there's someone, maybe they'll post on Reddit saying, okay, I know this, what should I learn next? I just wish it were easier for us to say, okay, let's imagine this from from the helper point of view. How do we make it easier for people to say, all right, here's, this is where you are. Here's some things that you can look into next. What do you do when you're coaching someone? You just
Yes, I always ask them what their needs are. Like there are some needs which are common. For example, completion. Like Vertigo, for example, I think basically everybody can benefit unless you have a really special use case. But other than that, it's like, well, we don't need to fix everything. Let's understand what your needs are. Let's work towards that goal. And one way to break it down also conceptually is with use package blocks. I think use package is an excellent, of course, it's an excellent tool in its own right, but it's an excellent way of saying, you know what, this is one thing, this is one step, and this is the next step. And so people can start thinking in terms of each use package is a step.
I sometimes feel like I'm going back and forth. Use package is nice because it allows us to, add the hooks and do, and say this stuff happens after the package is loaded, so I don't have to keep having lots of with eval after load. But on the other hand, it becomes harder for people to copy and paste things because then they have to know it needs to go inside the with use, inside the use package. There's no do I use the custom keyword or do I just use setqs because it looks more copyable? It's just like,
yes. This is why I don't use the custom. It's not I have anything personal against it, is that I found that it's unusable. Like if you have like the equivalent of this in a custom, you cannot do Control-X, Control-E on it. Like, and people, if you say, well, use package is syntactic sugar, I have read this before. To somebody who doesn't speak programming lingo, syntactic sugar doesn't mean anything. To me, it barely means anything after knowing all this stuff. So what does syntactic sugar actually mean? So what do I have to do to evaluate this, right? So I am like, okay, the more minimal you can do is just have a config, and then you can do add hook there, bind key there, or whatever. Granted, I don't do this here. I don't follow this. But I mean, if you want to have like a combination of what you were saying, of the back and forth while still retaining use package, you salvage that by doing the equivalent of this. Just this. And then everything goes under config.
And that's what I end up doing too. It's just like, just making it easier for me to change things and with and to reevaluate them with Control-X, Control-E is definitely one of the major considerations. Okay, I've temporarily misplaced my my YouTube chat. So some people are there. You are okay. Some people are very lucky. They actually have an Emacs channel at work that they can ask for help or they can come across like recommendations for. So that's nice for learning. Ross Baker says it's not a full replacement for these other ideas, but it brings together people solving the same problems with Emacs. So if people are lucky enough to work in a large company where other people are using Emacs, you should definitely take advantage of that. I hear there like there's actually a Discord server as well, and of course there's IRC where people can also hang out and hear other people talk about Emacs, ask questions, learn from other people's questions. Do you like you? I don't think you hang out in IRC or any of these places.
No, I'm like I haven't done it in a very long time. I have an account there on IRC. I think the last time I did it was in the last Emacs conf I could attend, which is like maybe 2 or 3 years ago. I forgot already. So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
sorry, folks.
Yeah. No, it's yet another thing that kind of distracts your attention. Uh, I I also find Mastodon to be very helpful for this kind of just
Mhm.
stream of little updates from people sharing their Emacs questions or their the things that they've just figured out. So that's another useful resource for people. And I've
Mhm.
started
Mhm.
trying to get people to like support them in hooking up with this community, like connecting with this community. So like the Emacs newbie page has a link to learning Emacs, and one of those things says like links to category community, because if you're learning these things in isolation, you will get really stuck, and you will not progress. I think being able to connect with the Emacs community is great for inspiration and figuring things out.
Yes, yes, I agree. I agree. Plus, it's another reason to hang out, basically, like the social aspect of it. It's like, well, of course, I use it as a tool, but there is a cultural component to it.
Oh. So tell me, what is your impression of the Emacs culture so far?
Oh, it's of course we are talking about people who stick around, right? Not people who will use Emacs once and then leave. I think fundamentally it's people who care about sharing. I think the essence of it, it's really sharing. And then, of course, that is expressed sharing code, sharing ideas, and then, of course, documenting things. So the documentation culture of Emacs, I think it's really strong. Like in other free software communities, they are like, okay, we are sharing code, but then code is its own documentation kind of thing. Good code speaks for itself kind of thing. Whereas in Emacs land, we are like, okay, good code speaks for itself, but here is this wall of text just in case.
And this is probably something only two other people in the world will ever want to do, but here it is, just in case. I love those, and we're like, yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to do. Actually, thank you. Yeah, I agree. I agree. It's a wonderful community, and that's I'm very glad that you're part of it, and I'm very glad that lots of other people have joined in as well. Okay, let me go. Once again, I misplaced my. Okay, here we go. Shay asked, is there a way to ask Emacs which file is it has read to
Mhm.
load the current configuration? That's the user-init file
Yeah.
variable, Shay, so you can just describe that. Charlie says, thinking of the terminology problem, maybe offering search terms for further exploration rather than or in addition to links, which
Mhm.
I guess like instead of just linking
Mhm.
to a
Yeah.
specific resource, which may or may not still exist. I was going through my beginner resources, and it's like this page no longer resolves, but like saying, okay, this is what it's called, and you can go search for your own resources, or this is the link, but also here's some other terms that you might find useful.
Yeah, yeah. Just to add to what this person was asking, was suggesting, is like, because we had something like this in the note and eventually I implemented it. So there are two kinds of links. One is a direct pointer where it's like, go there. The other is basically the equivalent of a button that triggers a search. For example, let's imagine in terms of files and directories, like a direct link goes to a file. A query link, you click on it, it opens a directory listing of all files that match the query. And that is basically evergreen. It will always show you whatever is matching.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
maybe we could have something like that for info buffers, where instead of a link to a node, you do that and it produces a listing of all nodes that match the query.
That might be interesting. Or like when we, if we're writing about something, we can say, here's the apropos command to go find all the
Hmm.
command,
Hmm.
things
Hmm.
that are related to this concept. Or even just getting people to learn about how to use apropos, I think would be a great step
Yes,
in
yes,
helping
yes,
them.
yes.
But even before that, just getting them to a completion setup where they can ideally use something like orderless to just find things.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think it would definitely help with the discoverability thing.
Yes, I think like vertical and orderless are like if you have to install two packages, it's those two.
Yeah. It is great. Okay, where are we now? I keep clicking the wrong button. Okay, let's see. We've talked about. I have like 15 minutes left.
Uh-huh.
So we've
The
talked about
sandwich.
discoverable. The sandwich has to be made, and we talked about kind of the getting people into it, helping them discover concepts, helping them connect with the community, and then there's a thing about how do we support people as they do their lifelong learning. A lot of people, maybe they'll get through the tutorial fine, but then when they start to try to do something more sophisticated, like, oh yeah, I need to do something similar to my IDE. I want to have all these different bits and bobs like working the way that they do in my other editor. That's where things break down, because the tutorial gets them through the, here are the basics, but then there's this huge gulf before that. Okay, this is how I'll be more productive with it. How do we fix that?
Yeah. Yes, that's very difficult because part of that requires Emacs Lisp knowledge. Like, for example, an IDE, of course, I haven't used one myself, but from what I understand, there is a sidebar with the tree view of your files. At the bottom, there is a shell. Maybe there is some debugger there, something, some other sidebar on the side. So to replicate that, you really need to massage the display buffer A-list, which I think requires a lot of knowledge. Like, you need to understand the display buffer. You need to know about window, what's it called even? I forget, attributes and all that.
I don't even do it myself. If I feel like I need to do anything related to display buffer A-list, I'm just like, okay, I'm going to look for an example and I'm going to copy it very carefully.
Okay, so this is for you then. It's like too much work. But I must say, this looks like arcane knowledge, but this sort of thing actually is a quality of life improvement to your Emacs, because one thing that I think is bad about the default Emacs experience is uncertainty about where things will show up. Like, you never know. Like, you cannot predict it. Because Emacs tries to be sensible about it or whatever, but you cannot predict it. Whereas things that are ancillary should have kind of a more predictable behavior. And by the way, there is a package by Karthik Chikmagalur called Popper. I didn't mention it, but yeah, it's basically another way to do the display buffer A-list.
So there's an interesting thing here where you have the beginners, okay, they're just getting through the tutorial. If they can get to the point where they can edit the file, click on, even just use the menu bar to say file save, file open and all that stuff, that's great. And then the step beyond that is, okay, how do they start to use packages? And it feels like in order for them to be able to use packages like Popper or all these, they gotta be unafraid to use Emacs Lisp, because all the packages, tell them, okay, just put this use package in your config, but you gotta be comfortable with
and that's why I think you have to basically circumvent customize. Like, the earlier you are exposed to Emacs Lisp, I think the better it is for you long term, because there is no way around it. You will have to deal with it. And even if you don't quite know how things work, like, even for example, this thing here, where it's like there is a line between them, even if you don't understand code, you can start to think in terms of blocks, even if you don't understand this code. And maybe with a few comments here and there, that can become a bit more obvious as well. But of course, like, you go to a package and the first thing it will tell you is, okay, add this to your config, and it's a use package declaration, for example. And you will be like, what is a config?
Yeah, right.
So the better for solution is for you to know that, like, quickly, learn it quickly.
There's this whole like intimidation factor, especially for people who are coming from non-programming backgrounds, and suddenly they're like, there are a lot of parentheses in this. Am I really? Do I have to be a programmer in order to use this? So, like, you just dove right into it. But I'm sure you've talked to people who maybe weren't sure about it. How do you get them over that hump?
Basically, the idea is treat it as something that is inscrutable right now. Just take it as is. Take it at face value, basically. You don't need to understand it. You don't need to be able to debug it. Take it as is, and just make sure, moving your cursor, that this kind of balance is preserved by checking that there is a parenthesis at the beginning and there is a parenthesis at the end. So show parent mode helps in that regard, which is enabled by default. Of course, you cannot really get around it. Like you cannot have a training wheels mode for eLisp, unfortunately. Like
Eh,
you can do something like rainbow delimiters, the package. Like
yeah.
you can help, but I'm not sure that helps like by a lot.
Yeah. Uh, and it's like, okay, so you just got to do it. Don't be too scared, but it's okay to just copy and paste and trust that as you do this, you will learn enough that when you go back, you'll be able to understand more and more of it.
Yes. What
Okay.
helps, like for example, in this block here, of course, I don't have to describe the code, but if you do this iterative approach that we mentioned earlier of step by step, like you can try your Emacs before this and after this. And based, of course, on some comment or whatever, you can see what the difference is. So even if you don't understand the code, you understand the effects
Ah,
of the code.
yeah. Before and after comparisons. I'm guilty of not taking advantage of this enough myself. I'm just like, oh yeah, I'm just going to evaluate it in my current Emacs, and sometimes the
Mm-hmm.
results are obvious, and
Mm-hmm.
sometimes the results kind of break my Emacs. And I'm like, okay, I got to restart Emacs instead. I should have just started a new Emacs and tried it there.
Yes, good.
But with the new user, well, I say new, but actually user-init-directory has been around since Emacs 29, so it's pretty
Mm-hmm.
much widely available now. People can actually try, for example, a starter kit without committing to it.
Yes.
Do you see newbies actually use this? Because I tell people, okay, you can do this, but it requires using the command line and using command line arguments. Is that a
Mm-hmm.
thing they've even like they
Uh,
can
I,
do?
I I have introduced it to some people and they have used it, yes. But I don't know if people use it as part of their workflow, or maybe like they have just a cheat sheet specifically for this, where it's like, oh, I want to try this and I want to try that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But eventually they don't use it day by day, I think.
Yeah. It's really
Like they
just
just settle. Yeah.
if you want to try something big, then you can say try that starter kit, but don't necessarily go to the work of making it my .emacs.d and so forth.
Yes.
Although a lot of
Yes.
the
That's
starter
a good
kits,
one, I think.
yeah, they just say put this in your init file, so it's a lot easier to back it out and change your mind. Uh,
Yes.
yeah. Which actually I had a thought, but it has disappeared. So I will just read something else from the chat.
That's fine.
Romsnow says, "Do you fear the Emacs C core will go unmaintained? Deep knowledge is rare, held by few, like Eli. While finding E-list maintainers is easier, like with Elfie, the core is hard to replace." So I guess if you're thinking about like the long-term newbie to package user to package developer to who knows Emacs core contributor, and then off to like the C, like somebody who knows the C core. That's a very long and somewhat leaky pathway.
It is, for sure, for sure. But of course, here we are talking about people who have expertise in those specific domains. And yeah, that's something that it's an experienced Emacs user already. Like we are talking about somebody who not only is actually an experienced Emacs user, but also knows the relevant technical knowledge, right? So I am an experienced user, for example, but I don't know C. So I'm useless in this regard. Yeah.
And I guess so. If we zoom out a little bit, that's more talk. If we can think about okay, how do we help people connect with the long term motivation that drives that you mentioned earlier,
Hmm.
to keep using Emacs, to learn more about it, to enjoy using it and filling with it and get deeper into it. There's some,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
for some people, Emacs clicks right away because they already tinker with other things and it becomes another thing to tinker with. For some people, it's like, I don't know, I've heard I should use this, or I've heard people say good things about org mode or about Magit. I just want to see what it's like. So, going back to that, how do we get people hooked?
Yeah. It's that initial awkward phase. Like if they can get past that, and by awkward phase here I mean to actually understand, MX and the key bindings and how to move between windows, and there is a minibuffer, that sort of thing. Once they get past that, I think that people stick around. Like if they have, for example, a use for it, such as, okay, I use it for org, they do stick around. And there are a lot of people who contribute, like even non-programmers. And this is something I encourage in my packages, for example, where it's like, write me an issue. You don't need to know any code. You don't have to tell me about how to do it. Just tell me what your idea is. And in all my manuals that I write, I have an acknowledgement section where I have, ideas or suggestions or whatever. And I write the name of everybody who has ever created an issue, because it's like you help even by telling me what your use case is.
Yeah.
And that already helps. And it gets the people involved as well.
They spend time trying it out and describing what the difference was between what happened and what they wanted to happen. And sometimes even just identifying the issue is like a big part of it already, because you can't test everything. So we can definitely help people feel more more included in the community, because they don't have to be core developers or package authors to be part of the community. Even using it and writing about it is a big help.
Yes.
In the 4 minutes before I have to make a grilled cheese sandwich, shall we wrap up with some concrete things that you or me or somebody listening to, can do to help improve the newcomer experience for Emacs?
You were doing it already, like you were doing the wiki. I think that's good. A direct link to the newbie section, I think is great. Maybe you can even have a permanent link in your Emacs news, like the topmost line. It would be like, well, new, go there. Ignore the rest.
Don't get overwhelmed by all these people talking about SDL graphics loops and Emacs and whatever.
Yes.
Cool, but that's very far down the path of the learning journey. So so making one of these starting points where people can then kind of find the trail that then leads them to different places. I'm looking forward to reviewing the Emacs news things for beginner resources that I already previously identified, and then fitting them into the Emacs wiki in various places where people might come across them. And then, of course, it would be nice if we could test these with actual people. So in your coaching sessions, we can find out where the other gaps are.
Yes.
And there's a lovely conversation in the chat about other things that I haven't. I don't have the fast speaking rate to cram into the next 3 minutes, so I'll go back over the chat later and do the comments thing and whatever. But thank you so much for this conversation. It was great.
You're welcome.
I always like picking your brain about things. It's a big project, but Emacs it's fun to play with, and I hope lots of other people come to have fun with it too.
Yes, and maybe I can make a final comment about the C core and the fact that there are a few people such as Eli, Zaretsky, who have expertise in that. I am an optimist. I think things will be ironed out. Like, I think they will work out on their own. Like, there are people who have the expertise. Maybe it's a cultural issue, or we could say like a bureaucracy issue, like they don't want to deal with mailing lists or whatever. Maybe they don't like the current style. I don't know. But I'm sure that when push comes to shove, somebody will step up.
And I think it's actually very encouraging that because Emacs has such a long history, we've actually seen this kind of generational transfer of knowledge already, in the sense that, that the people who are maintaining Emacs now, aside, of course, from Dr. Stallman himself, they're not the originals who started this project. They came into it afterwards, decided they liked it, dug deep enough into it to learn all these different things and have continued from there. And we've also seen lots of trends come and go. People leave Emacs for Atom. People come back when Atom gets discontinued. People leave Emacs for VS Code. Who knows what will happen then? But if they come back, they come back bringing even more ideas that they want to implement in Emacs. So when as people leave for other editors or they come back, it's always interesting to see what they will take with them. And we want to make it easier for people to come in and out as they feel like.
Exactly.
Okay, so in about 1 minute, the kid is going to start barreling down the hallway and asking for a grilled cheese sandwich. I'm going to wrap it up nicely here so I can remember to copy the chat this time.
Very well, very well.
Yeah. The notes are going to be in, like, if you go to YE24.com, they'll probably be going to be in like YE24, and you're going to send me this markdown file or whatever that you send me. Okay, so I can post that as well. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Prot, and thank you to the people who joined in the chat. We'll see where it goes. Okay, bye.
Take care. Bye, Sacha. Bye, folks. Take care.